Welcome, everyone. Many of you turned up in this beautiful weather in the Netherlands. So thank you very, very much for being here. We are here today for a very special book, a book written by Koenraad Jonckheere, professor in Northern Renaissance and Baroque art at Ghent University. It's very recently published with Hannibal Books. The book is entitled Another Story of Art. And this book sketches the story of art from antiquity until the present. But, and that's why I invited Koen, because it's fascinating how he did it. He did it as kind of a kaleidoscope. 7 chapters he used to rewrite the history of the visual arts from 7 different angles. Craft, theory, economy, paragone, politics and religion, iconoclasm, and eventually style and meaning. Hence, art is not presented as a self-fulfilling aesthetic prophecy, but as the complex entanglement of human ingenuity and rapidly changing historical contexts. And who is better equipped than David Freedberg to say something about the book, to review the book? Maybe he doesn't need any introduction, but still, let me do it just to enjoy doing it.
Briefly.
He is professor of the history of art and director of the Italian Academy for Advanced Studies in America at Columbia University. And he was also director of the Warburg Institute at the University of London from 2015 to 2017. Professor Freedberg is best known for his work on psychological responses to art, and particularly his studies on iconoclasm and censorship. First, he investigated this topic in the early 70s in the context of the Dutch Revolt, which was followed by the landmark book, The Power of Images, Studies in the History and Theory of Responses, published by the University of Chicago Press in 1989. And me, myself, I really was much influenced by the book. It was also edited in many, many languages, translated and edited in many, many languages. Much of Freedberg's time now is taken up by his directorship of the Italian Academy for Advanced Studies in America and his commitment to fostering interdisciplinary work across the humanities and the sciences. At the Academy, he established its pioneering humanities and neurosciences project with the aim to bring humanists and science together. Professor Freedberg, thank you very much for being here. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Stijn. So, dear Stijn, dear Koen, dear Gauthier, thank you so much for having me here today. If there were time, I'd tell you about my first visit to Leiden. I think I hate to say this, in 1970, when I had the honor of meeting Hans van der Waal, who seemed very ancient to me, though he was much younger than I am now, and Rudy Fuchs, or not much younger, a little younger than I am now, and Rudy Fuchs, who, of course, then seemed very young indeed. We spoke about van der Waal's own survey, the 3 eeuwen Vaderlandse Geschieduitbeelding, then about Dial. I suddenly realized, I was thinking about this Koen's book today, we could have a whole conversation about Dial, its fates and its futures. And about Rembrandt, and of course it was Rudy Fuchs was there, about Rembrandt and modern art. Okay, let me see if I can pull this off here. It's a real honor to be here today. It's an honor to introduce what is truly another history of art. Now, if you say this with the right inflection in English, what you really mean is a response to the way the phrase is usually taken in English, which I imagine Koen is ironizing. In other words, oh no, not another history of art. But if you say it right, it can also mean, no, this is not just another history of art. It's another history of art. It's something else. In colloquial English, of course, that's something else. It's something else. It's another history of art. That something else always means something superlative, something at the very top of the tree, something, as we art historians like to say, imparagonabile, something without peer, something that wins the ancient paragone. That's Jonckheere's Another History of Art, which is my privilege to present to you this afternoon. Not that the competition's so stiff, mind you. When I first began teaching the history of art in 1973, another date I hate to recall, I was so young and arrogant that I thought, no, I'm not going to use a survey in my class. That's not good enough. In my classes, we go into things in depth. No superficial surveys for me. Better to study the selected topics in depth. In a way, I still think that. But then, in an unusual fit of modesty for the time, I thought, okay, let me just have a look at the surveys around here, just to be sure I'm not doing the students or the history of art an injustice. So I picked up Helen Gardner's History of Art, first edition 1926, can you believe it? It's still in use today, including my postdoc, who uses the 16th edition of 2019 when he teaches at Pace University in New York. But when I looked at it in 1973 to ensure that I wasn't depriving my students of anything, I thought, oh God, no. The history of art is such a great and such an urgent subject that how can I possibly give them such a plodding thing to read? Then I tried Jansen, which at least had a veneer of German intellectual worldliness and a glimmering of intellectual probing. No, much too boring still. Like Honor and Fleming's The Visual Arts, A History of 1982, 7th edition, 2011, it certainly remained better than the host of epigones that followed, like Laurie Adams' 1994 History of Western Art and Stockstadt and Cothran's 1995 Art History, which despite its superficiality and banality has now reached its 6th popular edition. Surely we needed more than just a survey of artists and epochs to introduce the history of art over the ages, to say nothing of other cultures. Now, when I was a boy and a teenager in South Africa, what really gripped me were the cave paintings of the San and the Kung Bushmen, as we call them. This was an art, by what standards I called it that, I did not really know. This was an art that was surely more intriguing, more interesting, more intellectually challenging than the paintings, which I found in my first survey of the history of art, the fat volume on my father's shelf entitled 100 Famous Paintings. Leonardo's Virgin of the Rocks, Titian's Bacchus and Ariadne. I remember these as clear as daylight. Frans Halse's Laughing Cavalier, as we called it in those days. Vermeer ×2, that's the Berlin wine glass and the view of Delft. Gainsborough's Blue Boy, Constable's Haywain. But I seem to know all those works already. They were so accessible, it seemed, that they must have been in my bloodstream at birth. They were unquestionably beautiful, and I returned to them over and over again. This mere listing of the same old masterpieces. I love them, but surely art, like life, was more complicated than just the beautiful look of things. No survey really began to plumb those other depths of art and its contexts, except for the one book that everyone still admired, Gombrick's Story of Art, which for some reason, I never understood why this book was only very rarely assigned as a survey. Was it because it revealed its origins as a Kunstgeschichte für Kinder, as Gombrick initially intended it? Or was it because it was too complicated for undergraduates? I never knew. But then came Kunstbuch, 70 years after the first appearance of the Story of Art. Nothing really to speak of or to write home about in between. 70 years, no great survey. Jonckheere's Another History of Art puts every other survey to shame. It wins the competition by a long shot. In terms of thoughtfulness and knowledge, it's a worthy but very different successor to Gombrick. Right at the outset, Kuhn makes it clear that while the philosophical fulcrum of Gombrick is the explicit notion that there is no such thing as art, there are only artists, in a way, Gombrick was smartly sidestepping the kind of aestheticizing art history which he despised, like Warburg himself. His book, Kunz, was going to take the opposite line, namely that art has to do with what its viewers make of it. Kunz is a social history of art that does not traduce itself for 1 minute, that does not traduce for 1 minute either the question of art or of art's materiality. In this sense and in many others, another history of art is both smack up to date and a more readable, less doctrinaire, more profound and yet more graceful social history of art than its nearest but much longer competitor, Arnold Hauser's multi-volume set on this subject. Over and over again, Jonckheere is attentive to the social context of art, to the period eye, to the materials of art, and to the question of what makes something art or not. When we pick up the book itself, we see the point right away. I don't know whether the publishers in other languages will follow the idea of Kuhn or of his excellent publisher Hannibal, and here I can't resist making a comment. You see, I like that name, Hannibal, for again, it's a case of us Africans crossing the heights to descend to the level of Western civilization, seeking to find its often inexplicable heights. Speaking of which, it's clear that though Kuhn shows his perfect awareness of period problems now, such as the need for diversity and inclusion, he acknowledges his avowed European concentration, not out of any sense of domination or hegemony, but because he believes, as I do, that only by knowing ourselves will we be able to know the other. Only by examining our own presuppositions will we arrive at a critical approach to the problem, especially as we move on to encounter the other. And this book is a great start to do just that. As I was saying, when you pick up the book, you see the point right away. You don't even have to open it, though as always, you must inspect it from the front and from the back as well. In this day, and in this day and age, you must also feel its not insubstantial weight. Remember that we no longer understand just by reading or by using our eyes. This would have been the subject for a continuing discussion. We understand by the use of all our sensory resources. So on the front cover, there's Courbet's studio. Good, you can see it, you know it, exemplifying so much of Western art. You know, it's got Parasius's curtain over the easel, the bearded painter, the nude model standing for the viewer's delectation, perhaps representing truth, who knows, while the painter paints a landscape and a bunch of men lazily hang around in the dark. That's as they look at the girl. Then there's the boy, the playing puppy, and everything all these things signify. Also the recollection of Velázquez, a veritable summa of the Western tradition in painting. And then on the back cover, the very rejection, the very satirization of illusionistic painting and its high aspirations. A copy, I just heard who made that copy, of Maurizio Cattelan's Comedian of 2019, showing a banana seemingly duct taped to the surface of the cardboard cover of the book itself. High aspirations, expensive materiality versus everyday sensual and sticky materiality, and its very possibility of decay as examples of how the criteria of art have changed. And perhaps Kuhn's signal that the only definition of art that works is the idea of art, the latest ruling paradigm of things, or the idea of art as being what constitutes art. That's the latest ruling paradigm of things, from Duchamp on to Sol LeWitt, and indeed to my old colleague Arthur Danto and many others. When others might have made such paradoxes sound implausible and complicated, Kuhn has a natural touch. He makes them interesting and never once wavers from his basic idea that all these things are wonderful and enchanting, as well as moving and disturbing. So as I wrote to our publisher, whom I'm happy to see here today, Gautier, suggesting why Kuhn's book should be translated, I wrote, "This is a narrative that's totally of the present. No other one-volume survey of the history of art is so rooted in the contemporary. It begins with the joy of the present. It knows what is significant about art now, beginning with a Woord vooraf about the bewildering variety and multiplicity of art fairs like Frieze. Jonckheere Kuhn immediately introduces the parallel to which he often and significantly returns, that of Bosch's Garden of Earthly Delights, and of course that title befits the book perfectly. It's hugely ambitious. Its disciplinary range is vast. its knowledge of the history of art, both wide and granular. And just as it ranges from the ancient art to the present, so too it convincingly discusses theorists of art from Plato to the exponents of current media theory, those people who are so sarcastically called the Kittlerkinder. By its own admission, another history of art is a survey of the history of European art. But at the same time, so it admits it's a survey of the history of European art. But at the same time, it's of the wider world too. It's more aware of current trends in the field than any introductory handbook I know. He makes it clear, Kuhn does, that not only there's another world of art outside the usual canons, but that he knows about it. So there's no need for a worry that the book will be subject to attacks. We see them coming from every corner. No need to worry that the book will be subject to attacks on grounds of a failure of attention to diversity or for not ranging widely enough outside its stated field. Kuhn makes even the out there sound exciting and critically engaging. So we don't have, at least, we have a survey that is neither pedestrian nor just a summary of an out-of-date canon, or even of a modern canon that takes itself too seriously. I mean, if you want to see a modern canon that takes itself too seriously, you only have to see the great 3-volume survey prepared by my past and present colleagues, Rosalind Krauss, Benjamin Buchloh, and Yves Lambois. This book by Kuhn is vigorous, up-to-date, unprejudiced, and lively. One can tell from the start that he enjoyed writing it and that it will be an enjoyable read. It's a history of art for our time and of our time. So right from the beginning, Kuhn takes the line that art depends on those who look at it. From the devoted custodians in every museum, you know them all, devoted to the art they are indeed, to the crowds who throng the Mona Lisa in the Louvre. He wants his readers to know that the work of art is a product of the ways in which context and audience make it effective or magical. For him, it's the relationship between the work and its viewer that constitutes its art. In other words, so it's not just concept, but it's the relationship between the work and its viewer. In other words, Jonckheere's position is the very opposite of Gombrick's in the story of art, where he claims that there is really no such thing as art, only artists. It's a position that's Gombrick's view. So Kuhn's contrary position is one that is certainly more with it and more in line with current thinking about art and more likely to attract the constituents of the book's potential market. And so instead of starting with a predictable Marcel Duchamp, if he wanted to start in the modern world, Kuhn makes his point by a chapter entitled, as Stein mentioned, a chapter entitled Van Zwart Vierkant tot Kaleidoscoop. It begins with Malejevich's 1915 Black Square, which is really the leitmotif of the book. It returns over and over again, like a Wagnerian leitmotif, where the artistic status of the work is entirely dependent on its context. And then it continues with one of Jeff Koons's gazing balls, in which viewers see both themselves and a great work of old art, in this case, Titian's Concert Champêtre, reflected in the ball. So narcissism, this is typical Jeff Koons, narcissism and fabulous possession all at once. It's a challenging start to the book, and it makes sense to have Malevich followed, after we've got over the crunch of Koons, makes sense to have Malevich followed by Michelangelo's Last Judgment, whose value, as you know, is richly established by its context, however different and however much more it may be predicated on craftsmanship alone. These are the themes which Kuhn insists on following throughout this book. Later on, of course, he shows why what we pay for now is as much as for the idea, however vulgar or simple-minded, as in Koons, as for the actual value of the product. But though Malevich is a high point of 5 centuries of European art, it's more than just ordinary black paint in a geometric shape on whitened canvas. It's neither exceptional from a painterly point of view nor from a material one. Anyone could make it. Outside its context, there would be no reason whatsoever to regard it as an art historical masterpiece. yet it costs, as we all know, tens of millions on the open market. It would cost that. Compare this, Kuhn says, with Van Eyck's Ghent altarpiece with a Sistine ceiling, or then again with Damien Hirst's diamond-encrusted skull. Why should all these totally different phenomena be regarded as art? It's not intrinsic value, it's not craft, it's the context of the thing. And so off he goes on his gripping tale. Art's made by its viewers, its users, its buyers, its capacity for politicization, its vulnerability to destruction. The subject, of course, that first solidified our friendship over the years, ever since Kuhn started producing his brilliant histories of Netherlandish art and artists in the age of iconoclasm. So every chapter is wide-ranging. It seeks the connections across centuries, but it never loses sight of a chronological backbone, a backbone that doesn't appear in the usual way in the structure of the book, but one that is always implicit and easily graspable. One retains the thread, the chronological thread, through these excursions into philosophy, into sociology, into social history, into economics, and into science. It's a work of genius in that respect. He takes the old topics of measures of artistic skill, financial speculation, legends of the artist, magic and images, and sees how they appear in different formations across the centuries without ever making the reader lose their sense of the specific context of each work. So he writes, if you forgive the mixed languages, but they convey what I want to say, it makes, on the one hand, sine ira et studio, ma con passione. He keeps cool. He doesn't worry too much about the commercialization of art. And I see that I've already come to the end of my time and have only got more or less to this quick summary and the end of the first chapter. But so I just want to rephrase, if you'll allow me. If you give me a few more minutes, not too many more. You know, I want to rephrase the way Stein set it up. I want to be a little more precise because I think we need to be precise because these are brilliant sections. I only counted, well, I guess there's 7 altogether, but section 1 after the word vooraf is art as product. Section 2 is art as idea. At least, I was going to say at least in English. I'm telling you, it reads so well in it Nederlands that I keep on thinking I have read the English book, but actually I only read this book. So section 1, art as product, my translation. Section 2, art as idea. Section 3, art and science. Section 4, art, power and faith. Section 5, form and content, which, as Kuhn rightly mentioned, covers the question of style and context, style and meaning. Epilogue, very important. Art as interaction. Everything's here. Just yesterday, to pick up on the epilogue, art as interaction, and give you a sense of how all this brings one right up to the present. Just yesterday, I was talking in Milan about the relational art of Pierre Huyghe in its relation to the rise of extended reality, artificial reality, mixed reality, and of course, virtual reality. These are the new techniques which are going to come in the next version of the book. Kuhn brings the entire history of Western art, up to date until now. I don't think anyone who has produced a survey, not even the great Gombrick, was able to bring it so close up to their own present. So we can't discuss all these sections. I just want to say something about the third section on the science of art. It's a particular success, and I'm happy about that because, as we all know, for some reason, the history of science has grabbed the crown of the humanities away from the history of art. Schade, as we would say, and sometimes perhaps incorrectly, but still. So here's Kuhn, who, when he talks about the history of science and the history of art, or science and art, he begins with the contemporaneity of Malevich and Einstein, moves back to the well-known issues of proportion and perspective, and to the works of writers like Cennini, Piero della Francesca, Dürer. Then the influence of the great Arabic theorists, then the differences between the Flemish Ars Nova and the Italian Renaissance, then discussion of questions of technique, from fresco, tempera, panel, and canvas painting on through photography to the experiments of Dan Flavin with neon and the latest engagements of Olafur Eliasson with the subject of climate change, which I also was talking about just yesterday in Milan. That gives you the idea. It may all sound too wide-ranging and random, but it's nothing of the kind. It's systematic and always exciting. So as I said, that perfectly entitled Art as Interaction as the epilogue, it both epitomizes the underlying thesis of the book and is extraordinarily up-to-date. It makes clear that art is not just a matter of aesthetics or aesthetic pleasure, that it's not just to be associated with museums and the varieties of white glove treatment with which it is often associated. Iconoclasm finds its way back into the discussion. The matter of both artificial intelligence and deep fakes receive their due comments, and the whole work comes to the marvelous and perfectly epitomizing conclusion, necessarily brief at this point, that art is not what it is what it becomes. Art is not what it is what it becomes. And so we have the most wonderful, the most intelligent, the most compelling of all possible surveys. It's more than that. It's for everyone, not just for students or the allegedly elite lovers of art. Anyone who wants to know about the history of Western art, and there are still many of them, will want to read it. The question, of course, that it raises is, what next? What awaits? I have some ideas, but for that we need another day, maybe in Leiden when we can all be close to each other in person. And Koen would be the first to admit that such a book is not an end, but just a beginning. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much indeed. You're more than welcome in Leiden to address the future of the book. Absolutely. We'll organize that after the whole Corona crisis is over. Thank you very much. Koen, floor is of course yours to respond now to the review. But first, let me introduce you. I already said that Koen Jonckheere is professor in Northern Renaissance and Baroque art at Kent University. He published widely, not wildly, on 17th and 18th century art markets and on 16th century Antwerp history and portrait painting. His monographs include the auction of King William's paintings, Adriaan Thomas Kay, and Willem Kay. Recently, Antwerp Art After Iconoclasm, a book on decorum experiments in Netherlandish art after the Beeldenstorm, edited by Yale University Press, 2012. In Leuven, he curated an exhibition on the prolific 16th century painter Michael Coxy in 2013. From 14 to 19, Jonckheere served as editor-in-chief of the Corpus Rubinianum. Currently, Jonckheere is finishing a book project on a methodological issue, which is called the Timantis effect. Questions existing art historical interpretative models in that it focuses the early modern concept of quaestio as a guiding principle for interpretation. Koen, thank you very much for being here. The floor is yours. I'll put on your slide. Okay. There you go.
Thank you, Steen. I don't know if I have that much to add. I'm actually a bit emotional about the very, very kind words of David. But dear friends and colleagues, I'd say dear pixels on my screen, I hope all's well and that the love of art could bring you some relief. And thank you for logging in to this event. And thank you, Steen, Leiden University, for organizing this. Thanks to everybody who made this book possible. Hannibal, of course, with Gauthier, Hadewig, Severin. Not to forget Paul van Kalsten, the fabulous editor who made this book possible, and Gert Doreman, who designed it, and all the others who were more or less involved. But thank you, especially David, for generously accepting to say something here about the book. It is an amazing honor. But you know, David, you probably don't remember the next anecdotes, but I think it's worth telling. Some 15 years ago, I guess, when we learned to know each other, at a conference on iconoclasm at Amsterdam, I guess you remember. I was very proud to present you a copy of my PhD. It had just been published at the time. And the day after, at breakfast, I was curious to find out what your first ideas on the book were. And your answer that morning kind of changed my career and the way I look at art history. And probably this book is partially the result of it. Your answer came down to this. I don't know, I don't think you remember. You said like, well, I think it's an amazing book, but now it's time for you to start thinking. Stunned, I didn't know what to make of it at first, but soon I started to realize that the research is at least as much about taking the intellectual risk of exploring the big questions as it is about investigating safe, comprehensible microcosms. There are questions, questiones infinite and questiones infinite, answerable questions and unanswerable questions, as humanists would say. The unresolvable questions are the most rewarding in the end, as they force you indeed to keep on thinking. I'll come back to this. I learned that from you, David. When I sat down and opened my laptop to start preparing this presentation about, I think, a month and a half ago or so, I took a quick look at Instagram first, searching for inspiration. As a coincidence, the Royal Museum of Fine Arts had just posted an image of Brad Pitt visiting its Bruegel rooms. Mr. Pitt was joined by the director of the museum and his close friends, the artist Thomas Housego, whose work, according to his gallery's website, has a striking ability to simultaneously convey states of power and vulnerability. Well, he sure has. When this picture was taken, the museum galleries with old master painting, including the ones by Bruegel and Rubens and all the other great masters, had just been closed, at least for half a year. To be precise, we are talking about the few remaining rooms which were still open, since most of the other parts of the old master section had already been closed years ago by the same director. Thus far, they have not reopened. Moreover, this picture was taken during lockdown when we all had to follow strict social distancing rules. The director of this museum is proud to show the famous actor and the contemporary artist around the museum's collections. But he doesn't think it's worth offering its owners, the Belgian citizens, nor the rest of the world access to these amazing works of art. The fin de siècle rooms, the specialism of the director, do remain open for all visitors. Well, while it might sound like I have a strong opinion on this matter, unlike the rest of Instagram worlds, which fiercely responded, I actually don't. Like many of us, I've also had the privilege of standing in front of such masterpieces too, alone with some colleagues on a Monday when the museum is closed. And just like the actor and the artist, I enjoyed these moments. Do I agree with the decisions made by the museum's director to close the Old Master section, or with the privileges granted to these stars to give them exclusive access? Of course, absolutely not. But I tend to look at such images, these events even, as curious symptoms of the phenomenon art. Take a good look at the image, the iconography of it. It's amazing. The artist takes center stage, advertising his life as a successful artist, posing before his famous predecessor's fall of the rebel angels. As a Christ Salvator, watch his fingers, with a famous screen actor on his left-hand side and a vain museum director on his right-hand side. And in between the actor and the artist is St. Michael. He stands as St. Michael, slaying the rebel angels who dares to challenge the divine. How fabulous is this? Rarely does one see the phenomenon art so well depicted. Here you have the politics of art, economics, branding, privilege, religion, performance, poses, and so many more aspects that make the study of art history so limitlessly intriguing. Bruegel could not do it any better. And all of that in one image. I could or can get mad about what's happening in one of the most beautiful museums in the world, but more honestly, an image as this one also makes my day, I must admit. Indeed, this Instagram post is merely a small anecdotal example of the phenomenon art. I have tried to describe it historically and on a macro level in my book. Unlike Sir and Gombrick and David refer to it, I am convinced that there is such a thing as the phenomenon art beyond the artist, and that we can study it from a non-artist-centered perspective. If we want to evolve to a global art history, the artist-centered cannot work as it is, even in the long history of European art, an anomaly. Art, if you ask me, is not what it is at any moment in time. It is what it constantly becomes. As soon as one starts to realize that everything orbiting this fascinating phenomenon becomes a constant sort of question, and thus joy. Art in the end is not purely aesthetics, the hand of the master, the inspiration, the composition of the panel, the original, or the contemporary context, its price on the market, the cognitive or emotional responses of beholders over time. It is all of that, intertwined and much more. It is a constant interplay of, well, everything. This book considers art as a catalyst, the object that absorbs meaning in history and drives the chemistry of thought and emotion. To grasp these multiple layers of meaning, I examined the history of Western art here from 5 different angles. The first chapter explores the economic aspects of the business, the art business, while the final chapter rounds off with form and content. Those chapters in between consider the impact of art theory, of the mutual influence of the arts and the sciences, and of politics and religion. These and other connections have lent value and meaning to art for centuries. In each chapter, we turn to the source of Western visual culture, ancient Greece, before floating back up through the time of the 20th century and the 21st century. High points in the history of art are used to illustrate the shifts, both major and minor, that have altered the development of art, great revolutions and small evolutions. The book is constructed, in other words, as a matrix. Each chapter runs through the history of art from a different perspective. Different phenomena obviously stand out in different eras, which understandably means that not every stylistic period, and certainly not all of the art discussed here, receive the same attention in each chapter. What is striking, however, is that these defining moments in art history were also ones in which exceptional synergies were created. By implication, this book cannot be, nor would it wish to be, an end point, as David rightly pointed out. The aim is to show that works of art are closely bound up with the historical dynamics in which they arose and the shifting perspectives from which they are viewed. It is not an ambition prompted by any postmodern motivation, merely the upshot of the fact that throughout my life, I've been much more fascinated by the phenomenon of art than by that of the life of artists. The book will hopefully enable the reader to view familiar and less familiar movements, works of art and artists in different ways, and hence to discover further new perspective within this inexhaustible domain that art is. And so, to come back to what you said to me that morning in Amsterdam, David. Since that breakfast chat, I've learned to find limitless joy in these questiones infinite. For as humanists already knew, the infinite question is the structural basis of invention, of inventio. This book is merely an effort to turn the question infinite that art is, into something even more complex and thus more joyful. It is now up to you all, to see if it works. Well, thank you all again for joining us. Thanks again very much, David, Gauthier, everybody who's helped me out with producing, writing this book. And I now pass this virtual floor to my publisher, Gauthier. Thanks again.
Okay, thank you. Of course, it's an honor to be here. I'm a proud publisher in good company.
proud to be here, and of course I want to congratulate Koen for his outstanding work. We lived with this book throughout almost 2 years in the process of the editing and the collecting images and talking about the book, and it's so great we to say that after the release we got really very good press coverage and a reprint already. So the effort and the ambition of the book is well received by an audience that is, as Professor Freedberg said, is bigger than the pure academic world, which is of course a rare thing to happen. Also for us in publishing art books, this is a real author's book. We published many catalogs recently, like the Bruegel or Caravaggio Bernini or Di Van Eyck, but this is a book that really has an author's ambition, and so very it's great to have it. And also I'm very happy to announce that we will publish the book in an English and also in a Chinese edition in the next years. The English edition will be there by the end of the year, and the Chinese edition next year. And it's also, we're talking with German publisher and a French also. They are considering publishing it. So that's really good and a very good thing. Thank you, Stijn. Congratulations, Koen, Professor Freedberg, for your support and the great introduction, of course, to the book. And for now, you can find it through our platforms and Hannibal Books website, of course.
All right, thank you very much. Great to hear that it will be published in so many other countries and languages. We already have loads of questions, so that's good. That's nice. But of course, if you have other questions, please put them in the chat. Let's start with Rosalind's question, Armiston. Maybe this is a question really for Koen. So who is really aimed at? David already anticipated on this question, but maybe let's hear the author about his ideas.
Well, who is it aimed at? I give my students are supposed to read it when they first enter university, and I took the 18-year-olds in mind who has some historical backgrounds, but not too much, who knows something about art, but not too much, to show how, in fact, how complicated and because it is complicated, how interesting art history is. And that's really the aim of the book. And thus far, it's apparently worked in Flanders and the Low Countries. That's really already, I don't know, Gauthier, if you mentioned it, it's already the second edition, and the second edition is also nearly well sold out. So that's apparently it appeals to a larger public. And I took the 18-year-old in mind when writing it. That's, you also have to imagine somebody reading the book when you're writing, and I took an 18-year-old student as a point of departure writing this book.
Yes, indeed. Another question by Menke Quirin. In what way does the structure or interrelations of your book relate to the constellations of Warburg's Atlas? In what way does your book reflect Warburg's history of art without words? Nice question, but hard to answer, I guess.
Well, the idea of the book is that art is everything and nothing. So art is also the words that we use to describe it. And of course, you can build a limousine like Warburg did, but that's a whole other kind of book that you should publish, and then you have to eliminate all words. I wanted to write a more traditional book, and that I also tried to explain that the complexity of art history by using and referring the language that we use about it, but that's something that you'll find in the chapter on Paragoni, I guess.
Mm-hmm. David, you can just, yes, there you are again. You disappeared.
You're
back. I don't know how this happens. It has a mind of its own, my mouse.
So good. And now there's the question about the scope by Claudia Swan. Can you reflect on the chronological and geographical scope of your survey and your ideal readership? For many who teach and study the history of art, focusing solely on European art may be considered pedagogically and historically retrograde, at least in the States. And then, of course, the question between brackets: or is Brad Pitt the ideal reader?
Well, I'm an art historian walking around in the field, so I know how it will be perceived in some places in the world. Actually, there was the ambition, and there's still the ambition to write a chapter on European art in the world. But I didn't want to, and I have parts of the chapter written, and I think they're okay, but I didn't want to include them for the simple fact that they would draw all attention to them. The discussion is so complex and so polarized at this time that everybody who would open the book would focus on that specific chapter to see what I said, how I said it. And I didn't want that. What I wanted to do is to show that European art and the way we Europeans look at our own art history is very problematic, because in line with Gombrick, we have all focused on the aesthetics and the superior aesthetics, etc., etc. And I just wanted to show that European art is also the very opposite, but that we just learned to ignore it over the past couple of decades. And that's what we should get rid of. And once we've done that, once we've got rid of our own problematic art history, we can start looking thoroughly at how European art fits in world art history from many more angles. And that's the reason why I didn't include the chapter. I might include one if there comes a re-edition in 5 years or so, when this debate is over. But I didn't want the debate to focus on this point precisely, because it would make things even more complex.
Another question about the scope is women artists. Mieke Reinders asked about that you only include 5 women artists in the overview.
Yes, but again, my ambition was not to include any artist. There's a lot of artists that are not mentioned in the book. What I would try to show is how the phenomenon works and how complex the phenomenon is, and how several artists fit in and others don't fit in. And I try to pick examples that fitted into that approach. So if you start looking for names in the book, you shouldn't, because that's not the idea. You'll find surprising names, you'll find very obvious names, but it's not a name book, and it's not a list of who's good and who's bad. It's the exact opposite. That's the thing that I wanted to get rid of. And sometimes women artists fit in, sometimes other artists fit in, sometimes anonymous artists fit it into the story. Because all that art is just art, with all its complexities, and that's how it was conceived, and how I built it.
All right. Then a question of Mahmoud Sulek, both for Koen Jonckheere and David Freedberg. I think it was Gottfried Böhm who said art history always ends in a paradox. It is either art but no history, or history but no art. What's your take on this?
Well, David wrote a book on that, so he didn't you edit or write his art and history and art or something?
But that book, which I wrote with who was it again? In California. The historian. Well, that book did not address the Gottfried Böhm question. And look, I think the thing is that Koen is clearly trying to get away from the idea of the transcendence of art. And needless to say, Gottfried is associating, I think Koen has answered the question very well. Gottfried Böhm is associating the notion of art with the idea of transcendence. And so that excludes history. But Kuhn is very insistent on, and this is more in keeping with our times, certainly with the English-speaking countries, even in fact with the young non-English-speaking countries in Europe. In other words, that we are determined to look at the historical dimensions of everything which we regard as transcendent, eternal, relating to human nature. Now, I myself, as some of you know, don't entirely agree with that particular take on things, but I think the general question, in other words, I think there's limits to historicization. That's a whole other question. But for, I think the response to Mechtil's question is that Koenraad, by taking the whole, he just said, that he's not interested in how we actually define art beyond this notion of art is what it becomes. And if art is what it becomes, it is not transcendent. We don't seek absolute aesthetic criteria. I think both Kuhn and I have expressed grave reservations about the notion of disinterestedness as a criterion of art, or at least as a criterion of any kind of aesthetic criterion. He was more articulate even now in his answers than he was in his book. So what do we think of Gottfried Böhm's declaration? Not much at this point. I mean, I know this is dismissing a very profound thinker, but he's out of date. And this is what I think is so interesting about Kuhn's book. It is remarkably with it, despite the fact, which I think Claudia Swan and some other questions arose, the question about the absence of women, and the questions about, the very different questions, of course, the questions about the non-inclusion of non-Western art. I think that one could make a case for there being more women, except Kuhn here is writing a history. One wants to say very often in the face of these questions, our histories are not always great. Our histories were admittedly exclusionist. It would be great to include more people who reach the historical canons if there were such. I mean, I'm saying, in other words, history of art, unfortunately, shows total genderization, total masculinismo, maschilismo, as we say in Italian. So that's a real problem. I think I'm just going to take the. I have a lot to say about the question of whether a history of art now must include other cultures. And I think, oh my God, then we're going to make it even lighter. The history of art. It's light without the GH, but LITE. If we have to cover absolutely everything, I think Kuhn's book, he's not making any claims for the non-artistic nature or the artistic nature of other cultures. He's simply saying, this is the chunk which I can deal with in one book. Frankly, if you were to ask me, if the book weren't such a great read, I would say, give up Kuhn. Because it's too long, it's too superficial. I get back to the views which I had when I was beginning my teaching career. We want to go into everything in depth. To talk about masterpieces all over the world would make for high superficiality. And I love the way Kuhn also answered one of the questions by saying that his aim was to show that Western art, in fact, is not a big deal. It doesn't have all the mystique associated with it. It's images that people enjoy in their own culture, which he has decided to. Now, of course, we can all go off with proselytizing books and say we must attend to other cultures, but I don't think that was Kuhn's aim. I think Kuhn's aim was to say, let's strip art of its mystique. Let's acknowledge that it has a place in the world now. I mean, I was moved by his inclusion in the most unpatronizing way of the custodians of art, as I tried to say, right at the beginning of his book. He is, of course, condemned because that is the way things are now, because he's a white guy writing about largely white men, which is not a good idea. But he can't write about everything. And I think by bringing Western art down, I think he actually does us a kind of service. I hope this doesn't sound too reactionary, but that's my defense of these questions. Sorry, we wandered from Gottfried Böhm. But it's all part of the idea that we've got to release this idea of transcendence, that art is, it's too vague. It's no longer serviceable. Even though we all have a sneaking feeling that there are some works which are greater than others, whether in our culture or outside.
Yeah, well, exactly. Art starts with a bit of paint on a panel or a piece of stone, and then the whole phenomenon explodes, and you see that in the West, but you see that all over the world. And I described the phenomenon in the West, bringing it down back to earth where it starts, and show how complex it is and how it evolved over time so that we can compare it to other cultures. And I'd love to see books of other art histories about other cultures, how it developed, how the art markets developed, how religion and politics interfered with art, etc., which would make a great comparison and make it more interesting. And well, it's not a secret for the people who know me, but when I visit the museum, I never walk into the rooms with European art. I couldn't care less. I look at it else, but if there's something that I want to study, it's and bring back to a very basic, scholarly, scientific level of knowledge, it is European art history.
Great. Maybe you can just to finish this presentation, talk about the next book project, Timantis Effect, quickly.
If I want to talk about,
Well, you don't.
yeah. Well, I have two book projects. I always have two at a time. One is called Art as Religion, Religion as Art. I have to finish that at one point, and the other one is Timantis Effect. I have a manuscript ready. And it's about the fact that the question, the idea of the question was crucial in early modern culture, especially in the Low Countries. It was the key concept in humanism. It was the departing point for Inventio, which we all think is a very great thing in Western art history, but Inventio is unthinkable without Quaestio. And the Quaestio is another line of reasoning that well, my point will be that in the 16th century, reasoning was completely different from our reasoning in the fact that they valued the question more than the answer. You think the answer is everything, they thought the question is everything, which is a very intriguing idea, I find. And so I'm trying to write a book about that.
The very, very last question by Josien Kostens. Why did you give an English title to a book written in Dutch?
Well, that's exactly to make the point that David stressed, that art histories are Anglo-Saxon tradition. That's also the reason, I guess, why the reaction to it in the Anglo-Saxon world is much fiercer than in continental Europe, I guess. And I wanted the doubleness of the title to make my point, and I couldn't find a Dutch title who could do the exact same thing. So this histories of arts, it's something that's typically Anglo-Saxon. Most of these art histories have written in the English language, and I wanted exactly this idea of, oh no, not another one, but also another one. You can look at it from a different perspective, and that's why I chose that title.
All right.
Another one discussed was Het Fenomeen Kunst, the phenomenon art, but it didn't work as well.
It's a bit more boring, I guess, than that title. Huh? Thank you very, very much, Koen, for presenting your book. David, being the referent of this book, Gauthier, for showing us how the future will be of this book. I really enjoyed this book presentation. Thank you all for being here. Next week, we have our new book launch, and you get all information via the mail. So I hope to meet you all next week. Bye-bye, everyone. Thank you very, very much.
Tot ziens allemaal. Tot ziens.
Bye.
Hartelijk bedankt. Tot ziens, Koen. Tot ziens.
Dag David.